So let's go ahead and get started. My zip forms is going to look a little bit different than yours if you haven't done any transactions yet, just because I've got things in here and you might not be at that point. But let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so in my transaction, I'm going to switch over to documents, and then this is where I would have any documents from my transaction. And because this is a test transaction, I've got a lot of documents in here. But if I wanted to add a document, I could click this Add Document section right here. And then I could either add from zip forms or I could add from my computer. So I already have the purchase agreement here. So, well, actually, I'm going to start with the cover sheet. Okay. So the cover sheet is a form that anytime I'm taking a listing or doing a purchase agreement, I always start with the cover sheet, because if I put key details into the cover sheet, it will automatically transfer it to all of the other forms in the transaction, and that will save me time. So with the cover sheet, I'm putting very basic information in here. So in this case, I'm representing the buyer because I'm writing a purchase agreement. So my buyer's name is Donald Duck. Donald Duck's email address is donaldduck@gmail.com. So I got his name and his email address. I don't care anything about his city or his phone number or anything like that. It's not needed. If I have buyer number 2, then I would do the same thing here. In this case, I'm only going to have one buyer. I don't have any information on the seller, so I'm going to leave that blank. And then here I'm going to put some basic information about the house. And again, the majority of this is going to be left blank. So I'm putting the address, 123 Love This House Drive. This is in the city of Tulare. I do want to put the county. In this case, it's also the county of Tulare, state of California, zip code 93274. I do want to put the APN number, and I would get that off of the MLS listing. So there's my APN number. I don't need the listing date. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to mark that it's residential, and that's about all I'm going to put on here. Now, if it was a mobile home, I would probably fill out some of the mobile home information here, but that's not the case. And then escrow, I'm leaving blank. And then the buyer broker. So I'm the buyer. I am representing the buyer. So I'm going to put my information here. So Keller Williams, Tulare County. I'm going to put my office DRE number. Whoops. And then I'm going to put my DRE number. And so I got the office address, the office phone number, my email address. I'm also going to fill in the seller's broker's information because I can get that off of the MLS. So in this case, let's say it's also Keller Williams. But this time it's Keller Williams, Kings County. So that's the next county over. They do have the same broker as I do. So our broker number is going to be exactly the same. They would have a they're going to be in the city of Hanford, California, 9322230. I'm kind of guessing there. 559. Their phone number doesn't really matter. The agent is going to be, let's see, the seller agent will be John Smith. His DRE number 12124782 or 84, just making that up. And then his phone number I'll just put that like that. Okay, so I've got my information, I've got the seller broker information. So again, I'm putting this in the cover sheet so that on all the other forms, I don't have to retype it, right? I don't need the lender information, don't need appraisal, don't need title information, pest control, disclosure, home warranty, homeowners association. There are some things in here, but that doesn't matter. I could just take them out and it would be the same thing. So does that make sense that I'm just adding very basic information in here? Probably 95% of it is blank. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to do the actual RPA. So I'm going to come over here to forms and I'm going to add a form. I'm going to come into my form library. I'm going to search RPA, California Residential Purchase Agreement. It's already there. Close it. Okay, I'm going to grab from the transaction. So here we go. RPA. Here we go. I added it to my workspace. So now my workspace has both the cover sheet and the RPA. Okay. This RPA is one that I've already been using, so it might have some additional information in there already, but let's go ahead and take a look at it. So I'm going to scroll down past my cover sheet, which is the 4 pages, and then here's my RPA. Now, the actual residential purchase agreement is only, I think, 16 pages, but you'll see this shows 1 of 26. So we've got 10 extra pages in our RPA anytime we fill that out, and that's because there are some disclosures that are automatically added to it, and you can't remove them, nor do you want to remove them. So the first one is the disclosure regarding real estate agency. This is the first form that you're going to ever have a client sign because the state of California feels that the disclosure of agency is extremely important. And so what this does is it outlines what a seller's agent can do. It outlines what a buyer's agent can do. It talks about an agent being able to represent both the buyer and the seller, and it talks about the seller and buyer responsibilities. And I'll go over this in a little bit more detail as we get down into it, but the agency is, do you guys know what agency is, or do you kind of need a little bit more information on it? You guys are good? Okay, so let me just say this though. Agency is determined at the broker level, not at the agent level. Okay, so if 2 companies, if the broker representing the buyer is the same broker representing the seller, you have dual agency, even if it's 2 completely different real estate agents that have never met. Okay. So on this, what we want to make sure is that we're marking the box. Okay, and so you can see because I had some, because I already had this form in there and filled out, it's got some information here that didn't carry over. So normally this should say, in fact, let me redo it. Let me redo it. I want to redo it for you guys. Let me come back into forms. I want to take the RPA out. I want to add, actually, I don't know if it'll let me. I don't think it's going to let me. Okay, so I should have prepared this a little bit better, guys. Or let me see if I can do it this way. So what I wanted to show you was the RPA where I'm filling it out, but this one has that, but it's also got some other stuff there because I already had it filled out. So we're just gonna go ahead and use it. It'll be fine. Okay, come back here. Okay, so we're coming back to the disclosure. So what I wanted it to do is I wanted it to bring this information from the cover sheet that I just showed you, but because I'm not starting with a blank one, it's bringing in different information. So I apologize for that. So in this case, we have two buyers. We have Mickey and Minnie Mouse. The agent broker, so again, that was Keller Williams, Tulare County in this case, the broker license number, my name, and my license number here. Okay. So this is all you need on agency. The agency form is the your information and your buyer's information. The second page, and you can see right here on the bottom of all the forms, it has the form acronyms, and then it'll say page 1 of whatever. So the agency disclosure is 2 pages. And the second page of the agency disclosure is just the civil code that gets mentioned in the first page. So nothing gets done with the second page other than we're providing it. The next disclosure is actually an advisory. So it's the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. And what this does is it just advises that, there are certain protected classes and we're not allowed to discriminate against them. And sometimes discrimination can happen even when we don't think it can happen. So like when we're doing a listing, right? If we say that, if we're putting in the description in the MLS and we say this is a great property for a family. Well, familial status is one of the categories that we're not allowed to discriminate against. So you want to be careful even saying this would be great for a family, because that could be seen as discriminating against a single person or somebody without, a family. I guess there's different definitions of family, but so we've got to be careful here. And then this is part of the reason that we used to do buyer love letters, where when buyers would submit their offer, they would write up a letter that would say, basically, choose us. We're going to love your home. We've got our 2 kids and our dog and all of that. We no longer present buyer love letters because it sets the seller up to discriminate if they know information like they have a family or they have whatever. And so anyways, this form is just an advisory saying that we're not allowed to discriminate and the different categories that covers. And in this case, buyer and seller would both sign this form. Okay, and then we have the what's called the PRBS, which is possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. And this is disclosing and consenting to it. So this is basically saying that as a real estate agent, I might, or probably am representing more than one buyer at the same time. So you are not my only buyer. Same thing, I can be representing more than one seller at a time. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you're not my only seller. Dual agency, I can be representing, both the buyer and the seller on the same property. And again, it can be at agent level, but it's always at broker level. And then this also says that offers are not necessarily confidential. And you'll see a lot of times that agents will say, well, I can't disclose that because it's confidential. And the reality is right here, it says that it's not confidential. So agents are allowed, with their seller's permission, to disclose the terms of what other offers they've gotten. And if you're submitting an offer for a client, I always suggest reaching out to the other agent and trying to see if, get a feel for where they're at with offers. How many do they have? What's their their highest offer? Where do you need to come in to be competitive? Some agents will openly share that information. Some won't, but it's always good to ask. And so again, seller and buyer, well, in this case, we're filling out the RPA. So the buyer's going to sign it, and then you are also going to sign it. And then again, down here, like the PRBS, it shows the last time it was revised. So you can make sure that you're, using the most current form, and then how many pages it is. So in this case, it's just 1 page. Then we come to the wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. And so this is basically saying that or advising the buyer that wire fraud is a real thing. And so what I always tell my buyers when I'm discussing this form is that when they get an email with wire instructions, they always want to verify that. So they're going to then call the escrow or title company to verify that they did indeed send wire instructions, but they don't want to use the number in the email. So if it's a fraudulent email, it's going to have a fraudulent phone number, right? So have them call the number that they know is an accurate number just to verify. Wire fraud doesn't happen very often, but it does indeed happen. And we've had it happen, here locally or almost happen locally. So definitely something to discuss. And then we come to the actual purchase agreement. So this is the RPA. I wish I would have had the different form for you guys, but that's okay. This still works. So our date prepared is March 25th of 2023. Now there are other forms that you will see where it will reference, it'll reference like the purchase agreement dated. And so it doesn't matter. It's not like the date that it was signed. It's not the date that it was executed. This is the date they're talking about, is the date prepared. Now, if I'm sitting in my office and I'm typing this up and I'm not going to meet with the client, or I'm not going to send this to the client until tomorrow, do I put today's date or do I put tomorrow's date?
Today's,
because I'm preparing it today. So the date doesn't really matter, but it is a date that gets referenced. So, okay, so this is an offer from Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse for 123 Main Street, anywhere. In California, the city's name is Anywhere, and I've got the APN number. Okay, so just looking at number 1, I have an error in here. What's my error?
you're missing the city.
I'm missing actually the county.
Oh,
So
county,
it
sorry.
goes, yeah, Anywhere's the city, and then this is the county. For some reason, so I review a lot of contracts and I see the county missing a lot of times. So just remember to add the county. If you submitted this offer and it got accepted and then you sent it to your your transaction coordinator, it goes to compliance, like they will kick it back because it's missing information such as the county. Okay. So then we're going to come down to number 2. Number 2 was agency. So we had that form way up in the beginning. Remember, it was the first form that they signed, and that form was about agency. So in addition to having a whole 2-page form, now we have a paragraph about it as well, because it's that important. As real estate agents, it doesn't seem like it's important, but to the DRE in the state of California, it's important. So here we're basically identifying who are the agents and the brokers involved in the transaction. So we've got ABC Realty with, whoever their agent is. I think I said it was going to be John Smith. And then Keller Williams, Tulare County with my name, Lori Dunagan, my broker license number, and my license number. So then we have these boxes, and so a lot of times these boxes don't get marked either. So the boxes show who's representing who. So because this is ABC Realty representing the seller and Keller Williams representing the buyer, it's very obvious that it's not dual agency because we have 2 different brokers, right? But when I did my cover sheet, I had put Keller Williams Tulare County representing the buyer and Keller Williams Kings County representing the seller. So that's still, they're both Keller Williams, but they're 2 different offices. So just based off of that information, would you say that that is dual agency or not dual agency? Okay, James is saying no.
Depends on if it's the same broker, operating principles for both offices, no?
Yes. So it comes down to the broker's DRE number right here and right here. So in this particular case, the broker in Tulare County is the same one in Kings County, so it would be dual agency. But if I go up a county to Fresno County, they're not the same broker, and so it would not be dual agency. So so just knowing that it's a Keller Williams office doesn't necessarily tell us anything other than we need to maybe pay extra attention because it could be dual agency. And then we don't see this very often, but if you had more than one broker representing a buyer or seller, then you could check this box. And then this number D, potentially competing buyers and sellers. Basically, this is going back to that PRBS disclosure form that is automatically attached that I went over a couple minutes ago. So as far as number 1 and 2, do you guys have any questions on any of that? Okay, perfect. Now we're going to get into the meat and the potatoes of the offer. So the meat and the potatoes, I feel, are the next 3 pages. So starting right here, item number 3. And so 3 goes all the way down to, 3A, B, C. I think it goes to, what's it go to? Goes past Q, I know that. It goes down to R. So 3A through 3R. Okay, so 3A, we're going to put in the purchase price. So in this case, we are offering $750,000. If it was an all cash offer, then we would mark this box right here. But it's not an all cash offer in this case. They have some form of mortgage. Close of escrow. Typical close of escrow is 30 days. It can be sooner or it can be later, just depending on what the buyer needs are. And this is one of those things where when I'm submitting the offer, I'm calling the listing agent and I'm finding out what's important to the seller because I want my client's offer to be as competitive as it can, right? So if it might be important that they have a short escrow, or it could be important that they have a longer escrow. And so we don't always want to assume that a shorter escrow is a stronger offer because it could be the opposite of that. What would be the reason that instead of putting 30 days after acceptance that we put a specific date here? Let's say this date is approximately 30 days out. What would be the reason I'd put a date instead of just putting 30 days in there?
To be specific and to be in the middle and have and not get to the date of the end of the week.
Yes, exactly. So if we can avoid it, we want to not close on a Friday. I feel like Wednesdays are really good days to close. We also want to make sure that, we're not closing on a holiday or whatever. So the reason that we want to close on a Wednesday instead of a Friday is, imagine this. So our buyers are closing on their house. They're excited to move in. We're supposed to close on Friday and they're going to move in on the weekend. Sounds perfect, right? Close Friday, get the keys, got the whole weekend to move in. Here comes Thursday. They've got all their stuff in their moving van. We're ready to close Friday. They've got people coming over and going to help them start moving in immediately, right? What happens if closing gets delayed and we don't close on that Friday? Now we're not closing until Monday because we don't close on the weekends. And if Monday is a holiday, we're not closing till Tuesday. And now you got your buyers who've got all their stuff in their moving van, who are ready to move in, who have nowhere to go because we didn't close, right? They're gonna be upset. If we're supposed to close on a Wednesday and it gets pushed to Thursday, or even if it gets pushed to Friday, they're not quite as upset because most likely they're moving in on the weekend and there's still like that little bit of cushion. So that's just something to keep in mind. But that also speaks to, what's the word? Expectations. So we always want to be managing our clients' expectations. And so even if we put a specific date here, we're letting them know that's a target date, not a guaranteed date. And that's not like a key term of the contract. So like it can get pushed. Sometimes we can close early. Sometimes it happens later. So just make sure that they know from the very first moment that it's a target date and not guaranteed. And that'll help them not be upset if things, end up taking longer than what they're supposed to. And then 3C, expiration of offer. So by default, the offer will expire in 3 calendar days after the last buyer signature. You can put in a specific date there, and it expires at 5 p.m. So what happens if you submit an offer and 3 days pass, you don't hear anything from the seller, and then on day 5, they respond back and they say, we've accepted your client's offer. It expired on day 3. We're not hearing back from them until day 5. What happens in that scenario? Do you have a guess, James?
I would say the offer has expired, so that means they're gonna have to rewrite it.
It's
So-
up to you.
Yeah, so it doesn't become void, it becomes voidable. So if the buyer still wants to move forward on day 5, then it doesn't matter that it's an expired offer, it can still be accepted, they can still go under contract. But it means that if the seller comes back on day 5, the buyer is no longer under any obligation to go under contract because it's a voidable offer at that point. Sometimes agents will want to put pressure on a seller, and so they'll make the offer expire like in 1 day instead of 3 days. I personally don't like when that happens. And if I'm representing a seller, I usually recommend that we still wait. I mean, it depends. Like if it's like if let's say we just went on the market, we've got an open house scheduled this weekend, we get an offer on Friday, or let's say we get an offer on Thursday, they say it expires on Friday. Is my seller going to be essentially pressured into accepting that offer, or do they still want to do the open houses and wait through the weekend to see if you get any more offers? So I'm not a fan of changing this, but some agents will change it. And so that's just a conversation that, you would have with your seller or your buyer. So then we have the initial deposit. So you'll hear this referred to as the EMD because this used to be called the earnest money deposit. And then they did some contract changes and they changed it to initial deposit. So if you hear, EMD, this is what they're talking about. Different areas have different amounts that are more common than other areas. There's no set amount that this has to be. I'm in Tulare County, and it's very common for the initial deposit to be 1%. Doesn't have to be. There are other areas where it's more common for it to be 2% or 3%. But basically, it's what your buyer is comfortable putting down. Now, let me ask you guys this. Is there a minimum amount that the initial deposit needs to be? No, it just needs to be something of consideration. So technically it doesn't even have to be dollars. It could be chickens, right? Now, please don't have your buyers put chickens as their initial deposit, but it just needs to be something of consideration. I would say 99.999999 times it's money, right? Something else that you'll see is our veterans. A lot of times if a buyer is using a VA loan, they don't have to have a down payment. And so this initial deposit ends up going towards their down payment at the very end. And so a lot of times veterans are, well, why do I need to do an initial deposit? Because I don't have to have a down payment anyways. So they can get this refunded back if it's more than what they need it to be. But this is, like a good faith amount that shows that the buyers, really wants to and is serious about buying the house. So this initial deposit is what essentially gets is what's put up as risk if they remove their contingencies and then fall out of escrow. And so I'll talk about that in just a minute. The higher this amount, the better your offer, but the more risky for the buyer if they were to not purchase the house after they've released their contingencies. So just know that. And I like to, you want to just explain that to your buyers. You want your buyers to always understand pros and cons of whatever decisions they make. They do have an option of putting in an increased deposit. I've never had clients do an increased deposit, so I've never used that. And then we come here to loan amount. So the loan amount, so obviously when we're submitting an offer, we've got a letter from a lender, either a pre-approval or a pre-qualified letter from a lender, and that will kind of outline some of the terms. But basically, you know, how much is their loan? It might be, so in this case, you know, the loan is for 80%, so they've got 20% down payment. If it's FHA, it might be you know, a 3.5% down payment, and the loan is, you know, 96.5%. If it's, again, if it's VA, this could be 100%. So it just depends, but you want to put in the loan amount. Now, this number doesn't have to be exact because it might change once they go into escrow and start working with the lender, but you want it to be as close to accurate as possible. So if the loan ends up being, you know, 590 or 620, like, it's not a huge deal, right? But we want to be as close and accurate as possible. And over here, we want to make sure that we are marking what type of loan it is. So it defaults to conventional. But if it's an FHA or a VA or seller financing or something else, we want to make sure that we're checking this box. Now, this is a important term. So for example, if you submit the offer and you leave it marked as conventional, and then it gets accepted, and then you realize, oh, you know what, actually it's FHA, I forgot to mark the box, or they were going to go conventional and now they're going to go FHA instead for whatever reason, you have to have the seller's permission to change the loan type. So that is a contractual term right here. So make sure that you're not just letting it default to conventional and forgetting that it's supposed to be a different form. And then, like, if you use FHA, it's going to automatically attach these two different forms, the FVAC and the HID, or VA, it's going to just attach the FVAC. If you're doing seller financing, there's a whole different seller financing form that you would use. And so that, you know, that matters. If you're going to do additional financing, so maybe you're doing seller financing, you know, you're getting a loan, a traditional loan for part of it, seller financing for another part of it, or whatever the case might be, then you would use E2. It's very rare for us to use E2 though. Then we come to E3. What type of occupancy is it? It defaults to primary, but it might be a secondary home or it might be an investment property. And so we want to make sure that we're marking those items as well. Balance of down payment and purchase price total. So the nice thing is that the system does the math for us, so we don't have to figure these out. But this purchase price total will equal the purchase price up here, and it takes into account how much was your initial deposit, what's your loan amount, how much of you know, how much is the remainder of the down payment that you're bringing. It doesn't factor in closing costs at all, but like I said, the system does the math for us on that. So any questions on this first page before I move on to the second page? Pretty straightforward. Okay. So then also on the RPA, so again, it's 16 pages. You're going to have your buyer, and then eventually the seller will initial the bottom of each of these pages. Okay, so then we come to page 2. So on page 2, we're kind of talking about, well, we're talking about like contingencies a lot on this page. So first of all here, is the buyer asking for any type of seller credit? So are they asking for a certain amount to go towards their closing costs, for example? That's the most common credit we would see. So you can put the dollar amount here, and then it automatically defaults seller credit to be applied to closing costs, or you could put something else if it was going to something else. There's a blank line here for additional finance terms. So if there is anything else related to financing that you needed to add, you could put that in here. On G3, this is seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. And then if that's the case, you would attach a different form, the SPVB. So this will probably be changing in the next couple of months with the whole, you know, lawsuit and our settlement and all of that. But basically, if part of your buyer's offer is that you're asking the sellers to pay for your commission, that is what this is talking about. If in the MLS, like right now, the majority of the things say that, you know, that they're paying whatever percent to the buyer's broker. Like if you're just taking what's in the MLS, nothing has to be done with this. This would be like if the MLS is offering 0 or they're offering an amount lower than what you have in agreement with your buyer. So that's when that would come into play. And then on H1, H2, H3, we're talking about proof of funds here. So if it's all cash, on all 3 of these, it defaults to being attached to the offer, or you can submit them, you know, X number of days, so 3 days after acceptance. You do not want to submit them so many days after acceptance. You always want to attach it to the offer, because if I'm representing a seller, I am not going to recommend that my seller go under contract with a buyer unless I feel confident that they can actually buy the house. And that would be with either proof of funds or a lender letter. So we want to go ahead and attach it to the offer. So verification of cash, this would be like a bank statement that has the account numbers, you know, blocked out. Or if they've got it in like a certain type of fund, let's say it's in their retirement fund and they're pulling it out, you can give a copy of that statement. Verification of down payment and closing costs. So again, bank statement or whatever that might be. And then verification of loan application. This would be the letter from the lender. And we would mark whether they're pre-qualified, pre-approved, or fully underwritten pre-approved. So it goes in order of strength. So your pre-qualified is the least strong approval. Pre-approval is right there in the middle. And then fully underwritten pre-approval is the strongest approval that you could have. So I see that this gets left blank a lot. And you can find out whether they're pre-qualified or pre-approved or fully underwritten just on the letter itself. It should say it. If you have any question about it, you can reach out to the lender as well. So any question on G or H? Okay. So then we come down to J and K, final verification of condition. So this is basically the final walkthrough that we do. So when a buyer buys a house, somewhere within the last couple of days before you close escrow, you'll take the buyer and you'll do a final walkthrough with them, which is called the final verification of condition. And basically you're looking to see that the house is in the same condition as it was when you went under contract, and that any repairs that were negotiated have indeed been completed. So that's what we're looking at here. And we're just saying that it'll be done within 5 days of closing escrow. An assignment request is if you want to assign this contract to a different buyer, you by default have 17 days to do so. And then we get into contingencies, section L. So a lot of times people think that there are only 3 contingencies. There's the loan contingency, the appraisal contingency, and the inspection contingency. But actually there are more contingencies than that. We actually have 8 listed here. So what the contingency means, so by default, these are all 17 days, and we can change them. We can make them longer or shorter. It's rare to see them longer. Normally they're made shorter if you want to be like a stronger offer. So the idea of the contingency is, so let's say I'm just going to do the inspection or the investigation of property. So my buyer has 17 days to investigate the property and decide that they either want to move forward or not move forward, right? So as long as this contingency is in place, if they choose that they no longer want to purchase the house, they can then cancel the escrow. They will get, or they should get, their initial deposit back. What they won't get back is any funds that they spent on appraisal or inspections. So they don't get that money back, but they'll get that initial deposit amount back. So same thing like with the loan. If they're going in and then at the end of the day, the lender says, you know what, you don't qualify for whatever reason, then as long as they have their loan contingency in place, they can back out, get their initial deposit back. On the appraisal, So if a buyer is purchasing with a loan, the lender's going to require an appraisal. If the home doesn't appraise for the full amount, so in this case, we are offering $750,000 for the house. Let's say it only appraises for $730,000. Now we're $20,000 less than what our offer is, right? That means that the lender is only going to lend $730,000. They won't do the $750,000. So now we have a $20,000 appraisal gap. So then in that scenario, it becomes a negotiation point. Is the buyer able to bring in an extra $20,000 in cash? Maybe, maybe not. Is the seller willing to reduce the price from $750,000 down to $730,000? Maybe, maybe not. Are they willing to come in the middle? Maybe seller comes down $10,000, buyer goes up $10,000. So it becomes a negotiation point. And if buyer and seller can't come to terms, then it would fall out of escrow. And as long as your buyer has their appraisal contingency in place, they would get that initial deposit back. But that also becomes a disclosure item for the seller for any other buyer that they go under contract with in the future. They have to disclose that they had an appraisal and that it appraised at X amount of dollars. Depending on the loan type and the buyer, they can probably get a new appraisal with the next buyer. If it's FHA, they cannot. An FHA appraisal follows the house for like 6 months. That's outside the scope of this conversation, but it does become a disclosure item. So what we're saying here is, how many days do we want for these contingencies? If it's a normal 30-day transaction, it's not super competitive. I'll usually leave these at 17 days. If it's more of a competitive situation where they have multiple offers, I'm discussing with my buyer their comfort level on reducing these down. Now, if you reduce the loan and appraisal contingency down, you want to make sure you're in conversation with the lender to see if they can actually do it in that amount of time, right? So I can't say we're going to do 5-day loan and 5-day appraisal if it's going to take a week for them to even get the appraiser out, and it's going to take them 15 days to be able to approve the loan, right? I'm just setting the whole situation up for failure if I do that. So be in conversation with the lender if you're going to reduce that. If it's a cash sale, there would be no loan contingency. Most likely no appraisal contingency. A cash buyer can still do an appraisal. Most of the time they don't. Even if it's somebody that's getting a loan, they can still remove their loan and appraisal contingency, but it's very risky that they do that, because if the home ends up not appraising or they're not able to get the loan, they are either purchasing the house or they're walking away from that initial deposit. And that initial deposit can add up to a lot of money depending on the price of the home and how much they put down. And then this is just all the different, it's pretty much all inspection items, but different types of inspection. So the investigation of the property is literally the like the home inspection and all of that, like the physical attributes of the property. It does also include insurance. So make sure that if you're at the point where you're going to remove your buyer's inspection contingency, make sure that they've gotten insurance already and they've gotten quotes and they're comfortable with that, because that falls under this category. Review of seller documents, that would be seller disclosures. Title report, you get that from the title company. Common interest disclosures, that would come from the HOA or from the seller. Any leased or liened items, this would include like any PACE loans or like solar or, water softener systems or anything like that. If you want to remove, other than the loan or the appraisal contingency, if you want to remove any of these, you would do it with a contingency removal form, which would be another form that you would attach right here. Any questions on that? Okay. I know it's a lot of information, and it becomes a little more real when you actually sit down and fill out one of these, which I suggest you guys do as a practice before you actually have an actual client that you're filling one out for. It'll help with your stress level in the moment. But then these things kind of make a little more sense too. Okay, and then we have L8, which is the sale of buyer's property. So if the buyer already owns a home and they need to sell that home in order to purchase this one, make sure you mark this box so that they don't end up being forced to buy this property if for some reason they're not able to sell theirs. And then there's a separate form here, COP. I had a client that was, I was helping them sell their house, and it was right when interest rates kind of started going up. I was going to say tanking, but they went up. And they went under contract at a new construction place, and they did that without me. I was not involved in that, so they were already under contract before they reached out to me. Well, they ended up not being able to sell their house for the price that they wanted, so they ended up pulling it back off the market and not purchasing the new construction. But they had gone in and they had done a bunch of upgrades, and they had put down a $20,000 deposit on those upgrades. Because they did not have the contingency in place for the sale of their property, they walked away from $20,000 on that transaction. And I wasn't involved in it, so I wasn't able to help them with it. But so make sure we're, always protecting our clients. And then we got time of possession. So it automatically defaults to possession turns over to the buyer, the new owner, upon notice of recording. I like to leave it defaulted to that. You could put a specific time. If you're going to put a specific time, I don't like to put 6 p.m. because at 6:01, they're sitting there and they're like, okay, you're not out, it's ours, whatever the case might be. I like to put it at midnight, because then it's like if they're a little bit late, if the seller's like a little bit late getting out, the buyer's not as concerned because it's the middle of the night. They just expect the keys in the morning. So I prefer midnight versus 6 p.m., but I prefer notice of recording. So this would mean basically that the seller is out maybe the day before at a minimum. If there are tenants in the house, no, let me back up. So this would be seller occupied or vacant units. So if the seller wants to stay in possession for after the close of escrow. So let's say we're going to close escrow and the seller still needs 3 days to get moved out, or maybe their other home is not going to be ready for 3 weeks and they want to stay for 3 weeks. They can do that if it's negotiated in the RPA. Once we have an accepted offer, at that point, it's kind of too late to negotiate that. So we want to negotiate it with the RPA. There's a form called the SIP, or the seller in possession, and that would allow the seller to stay a certain number of days after the close of escrow if all parties are agree. That can be done with money or without money. So the buyer could let them stay for no additional fee, or they could charge them a fee. And so if it's 29 days or less, then we have the simple SIP form. If it's longer than 29 days, it goes into a residential lease agreement, and it gets, many more pages and whatnot. So try to avoid going over 29 days if you can, because it makes the paperwork simpler. And then if there's a tenant in the house, then you would want to do a tenant occupied property addendum, and that just talks about things with the tenants. What I like to have in this, and sometimes maybe you have an investor buyer and they're perfectly fine with the tenant staying. Maybe they want the tenants to stay. That's all good. But if they're buying it for their own house and they don't want the tenants there, I like to set it so that the property is vacant 5 days before close of escrow. So that way we know tenants are gone, we can see the condition of the house, and we're all good. But know that a tenant occupied property, so tenants have rights. So depending on how long they've been there, they would have to be given a 30-day notice or a 60-day notice. And so our escrow, if the tenant needs a 60-day notice, we might not be able to do a 30-day escrow, right? We might have to do a 65-day escrow. And then notice right here, it says occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. So it doesn't even have to be somebody that's considered a tenant. It could be the seller's son or daughter or whatever. So this form might be used in more situations than you would initially think it would be used. The other thing is that notice to move. So when you give them the 60-day, so let's say we give them a 60-day notice, right? But we still want to close in 30 days. Well, if we close, now the original seller no longer owns the home. That means that that 60-day notice is probably not valid anymore because the notice has to come from the new owner, which means we would now have to give them another 60-day notice. So just, like double check that with the experts, but just be aware that if we give a notice and we change ownership in the middle of that notice, it might invalidate that notice. Okay, any questions on any of that? Okay, so then we come to these forms. These time frames. The only one on here that I really pay much attention to is the seller delivery of documents. So these are the seller disclosures. They have 7 days to provide the disclosures. If I'm shortening the investigation period, so maybe I'm doing 10 days for inspections instead of 17 days, I'm usually going to change this to 3 or 4 days instead of 7 days, just so my buyer can get the disclosures up front. I like my buyers to have the disclosures, if possible, before we do inspections, because if there's something in the disclosure that is a red flag or something that is a no-go, I want my buyers to know that sooner than later and before they start spending money on inspections. So just something to keep in mind there. And then we come down to page 3 here. And this is there any items that the buyer wants to have with the house, like the stove, dishwasher? Funny thing is, this bathroom mirror is automatically checked. We cannot uncheck it, so they will always be asking for the bathroom mirrors to be included unless specifically excluded here. So any additional items they want, any items they don't want would get listed right here. If the seller doesn't agree, then the seller could just do a counter offer back. So in the MLS, if it says spa to be included or spa to be excluded, you want to go ahead and write that on here, because anything that's in the MLS isn't a contract term, but there could be an expectation for buyer or seller from that. So if it says spa is included in the MLS and you don't put it here, seller has every right to take that spa, right? Well, now buyer might be upset when they get their new house and there's no spa because they thought it was coming because it said it in the MLS, but it never got on the contract. So make sure that even if it's in the MLS, that you're either adding or excluding it here. Okay, then we come to reports. Who's paying for what? And I know we only have 4 minutes here. I might go 1 or 2 minutes over. You're welcome to leave exactly at 12:30 if you want, but we are very close to being done. Okay, so NHD report. So everything's negotiable, right? But there are ways that it's more common to see it done than not, but you don't have to do it any specific way. So typically the seller will pay for the NHD report. That, depending on your area, is, I don't know, $69 to $99. If you want the environmental version of it, it's usually about $20 more, and it's just a little more in detail. If it's a standard residential property, I usually don't ask for the environmental one, but if it's a country property or it's land, I'll usually ask for that. If there's any additional reports that you want the seller to pay for, you can put them on here. If it's something the buyer's going to pay for, like let's say the buyer's going to pay for the pest inspection or the general home inspection, you don't even have to put it on here. They can get it themselves. They don't have to put it on here. In fact, if it's a pest inspection, you're better not to have it on here, because if it's on here, then the lender's going to want to see clearance. And it kind of takes away some of your freedom by having it here. And it doesn't cost very much for the buyer to pay for. We just did one, it was $125, and they have them less than that, but just because of the area it was in. Although we're all in different areas, so I don't know what it costs in your area. Usually the seller is responsible for smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. So I usually mark that seller. If there's any government required point of sale inspections, reports, corrective remedial actions, I usually mark seller here. Sometimes you'll see this get countered out, but it's good to put seller. So this is one of those things where it's very location specific. Some locations will have these things, some won't. The majority of the areas in my area don't have this, but one example I'll give you is in the city of Tulare. There are some areas that are, within the city limits that are still on septic tank. And when those properties get sold, they have to be connected to city sewer. So that is a point of sale corrective action. And that's something that, you want to make sure that it's negotiable. Usually you'd want to make sure that the seller is paying for it, buyer could pay for it, but just something that, an agent wants to be aware of. But that's, I think, the only thing I can think of in my area where this comes into play, and it's only on very specific houses. Escrow fee, I usually like to mark it that each is going to pay their own fees. It can be marked, both. If you put both, you want to put a percentage. So both is usually 50-50, but it could be 30-70 or, whatever. So you'd want to put a percentage there. And then each of our offices has a preferred escrow company. And so we do like you to write in your preferred escrow company. Sometimes you'll see seller's choice or sellers to choose if you want to leave that up to the seller. Owner's title insurance, usually paid for by the seller. And again, you can put seller to choose, or you can write in a company. The way I remember this, because this used to confuse me at the beginning, it's like, well, who pays for this? I know that the only choice on here is buyer. So I know, well, buyer pays for that, seller pays for that. So that's how I keep that in mind. City transfer fees, or city transfer tax or fees, and county transfer tax and fees, they don't always apply. If they apply, I always, I put seller. And then the HOA stuff, the first two lines are by default. If it's an HOA transfer fee, you can again put buyer, seller, or both. I don't do a lot with HOA fees, so I'm not even sure what the norm is, although again, everything's negotiable. Private transfer fees automatically defaults to seller, and I never change that. Again, any additional fees or costs, there's a line here where you can write in what that would be, and buyer or seller or both. And then home warranty. So on the home warranty, you have the option of buyer waiving the home warranty. If the buyer waives the home warranty, it does not mean they can't still get a home warranty, because they can. It just means that they're not asking the seller to pay for it, and they're not asking escrow to order it. If you do get it, you want to make sure that you put a maximum dollar amount in here. This cost has gone up, so this is no longer $500. It's $555 for this specific company. Each company will be different though. And, you could put buyer or seller, or they could split the cost. And then over here, you can either put the plan name, or if there are any upgrades you need. So I always put upgraded to include AC. But if there's a swimming pool, or if it's on a septic tank, or if there's a well, I'm going to add that here, and this number is going to go up. Okay. And then if there are any other terms or anything else that you need to put in there, you have some lines here to write that stuff in. So I know that was a lot. Any questions on any of that? Nope. Okay. And then we just kind of get down to if there's any certain addendums that need to be added. So for example, the tenant occupied property that we were talking about up above, if it's a probate sale, if it's a mobile home, you would mark these. If you're doing your buyer or seller is doing a 1031 exchange, you can mark these boxes for that. These 4 right here are automatically marked. And then like if you're in a area where there's like a wildfire disaster advisory, like you can put that. But some of this, like this SBSA right here, it's 14 pages long. Even though you can add it to the contract, we don't. We just add it in escrow. So you don't have to add these forms here. They can be added throughout the process. And then this just talks about the different terms. And so you'll see up here. So right here, it says, I'll show you on the top here. So it's got P1. So that's the area that's talking about here. But then it's talking about paragraph 9, or here it's talking about paragraph 10A and 11A. So if you come down here, this is where you see additional details. What is paragraph 9? What is 10A and 11A? So right here, 10A and then 11A. So that's how this references. You should know what this stuff says before you have clients filling out the, submitting offers. So while it's not the most interesting thing to read, we definitely recommend that you know not only how to fill it out, but what you're filling out and what it all means. Then we come down here to the back, to the bottom of it. There's these 3 or 2 sections here. My clients almost 100%, in fact, up to now 100% have initialed these, and this is agreeing to liquidated damages and arbitration. And so just, read these and know what these are for, and then they almost always sign them or initial it. And then here, if you have like an entity buyer, so if it's a corporation, if it's a partnership, if it's somebody that has a power of attorney, that information would get filled out right here. And then here's where the buyers would sign it. If there's more than 2 buyers, then you would use an additional signature addendum, which would capture those additional buyer signatures. And then we come down to 33 here, and this is where the seller is going to respond back. Either they're accepting the offer or they're submitting a counter offer, whatever the case might be. Here, if the seller has decided not to accept the offer, they would initial here. And this is proof that the offer was submitted and that it was not accepted. And then if you're representing a buyer, you can ask for this page to be sent back to you, which shows that it was indeed presented. When you're filling out the RPA, right here is your information, and this part right here, this designated electronic delivery addresses, this part gets missed a lot, so make sure you're marking either your email or text or both here. I like to do my email because I want documents to be delivered to my email. And then this escrow holder acknowledgement, this will be blank. Escrow will fill this out once you have an accepted offer, and then it just becomes part of your escrow paperwork. And then here's a presentation of offer. You can initial this, or you can have your seller initial it, and this shows that the offer was presented on such and such date. So we have this as proof of the offer being presented, and then we have here as offer not accepted. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Just about done. A couple more advisories that are going to be included. You've got the buyer investigation advisory, which is basically just telling the buyer the different things that they can investigate. They would sign that. And then the Fair Appraisal Act addendum just talks about appraisals, and they would sign that. And then this California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, this is like when you go to the doctor and they make you sign that form that shows what they're going to do with your information. Same exact thing, you would have them sign that. If it was an FHA or a VA loan, there'd be those couple of other documents that would get attached, but are not like automatically attached. And that's it. So that's the RPA. So then what you would do with this is, if you're in the PC program, we would want you to submit it to us to review, and then we would go over it and give you feedback. You missed this, whatever the case might be, maybe ask you some questions on your intention, and then you would send it to the buyer to sign. And you can have them sign electronically, which is the way the majority of them do them, but once in a while you'll get clients for whatever reason that can't sign electronically, and in that case you would have them sign with the paper, paper to pen. So that's the RPA in an hour and 7 minutes. Well, it's the cover sheet and the RPA. So no questions? Do a practice RPA so you're comfortable with it, and then go out, find some clients, and do some real ones. Let's make some money here. Okay, guys, have a good day.